There is something uncomfortable about Mexico before the 2026 World Cup, not because the talent is gone, not because football disappeared from the country, not because the expectations became smaller. The pressure is still enormous. But for the first time in a long time, Mexico does not fully know what version of itself it wants to become. This team is hosting the World Cup. That matters. The stadiums will be full. The noise will be overwhelming. The emotional energy could develop some moments. Destroy them, because tournament football does not only test quality, it tests identity under pressure. And that is the real question facing Mexico before 2026. Can they become a serious modern tournament team without losing the emotional intensity that wants to find them? Or are they still trapped between two different eras of football? For decades, Mexico built its football reputation on rhythm, motion, and survival. Even when they were not among the world's elite, that they were rarely comfortable opponents. The atmosphere around the national team always felt heavy. Fast combinations, technical midfielders, aggressive momentum swings, emotional crowd pressure, moments that looked chaotic but somehow carried belief inside them. That identity made Mexico dangerous, but modern football changed the standards. The best international teams today are not only emotional, they are structurally stable. They control transitions, they survive pressure without losing organization. They understand when to slow games down and when to accelerate them. This is where Mexico's story becomes complicated, because the current generation looks caught between emotional football and controlled football, between instinct and structure. At times, Mexico still attacks with speed and confidence, but against stronger opponents, the spacing can collapse quickly. Defensive transitions become vulnerable. Possession loses direction. Emotional urgency replaces tactical control. And this is the part people often miss. The issue is not effort. Mexico almost always fights. The issue is whether the system can survive tournament-level pressure against elite nations. Hosting the 2026 World Cup makes that question even bigger, because now the expectations are no longer external. They are national. Mexico's football history has always carried a strange emotional contradiction. The country consistently produces passion, atmosphere, and expectation. But the World Cup story often ends with frustration instead of breakthrough. Mexico became associated with consistency without true escalation. Good enough to survive, good enough to compete, good enough to remain relevant, but not quite able to cross the final psychological barrier. That matters because football cultures remember emotional scars. Mexico carries many of them. The pressure of home tournaments, heat comparison, historic moments. With football powers from Europe and South America, those memories shape how fans react to every generation. This current team inherited all of that pressure, but they also inherited a changing football landscape. Modern Mexican players are developing in different systems now. More players move abroad earlier. Tactical education has evolved. Physical demands have increased. The game itself became more organized and less forgiving. The Mexico now faces a difficult balancing act. They cannot simply recreate the emotional football identity of previous generations, but they also cannot become a cold imitation of European systems. The successful version of Mexico probably exists somewhere in between, and finding that balance before 2026 may define the entire tournament. Boosting changes everything. Normally, its qualification campaigns reveal a team's weaknesses over time. Pressure builds gradually. Away matches create tension. Competitive qualification windows force tactical adaptation. Mexico will not experience the World Cup that way this time. That creates advantages, but it also creates risks. Without the weekly emotional pressure of qualification survival, preparation becomes psychological rather than purely competitive. The team has more time to experiment, more time to rotate, more time to build tactical chemistry. But there is also a danger in that comfort. Tournament football punishes false. Mexico cannot afford to arrive in 2026 emotionally protected from adversity, because eventually the pressure will arrive all at once. One knockout game, one bad defensive transition, nervous performance inside a packed stadium. That is how World Cups change emotionally. And this is why the next phase of Mexico's development matters so much. Not just building talent, building emotional control. Interesting thing about Mexico is not whether they can attack. It is whether they can stay connected after they lose the ball. Because modern tournament football is brutal in transition moments, and Mexico still looks vulnerable there. At their best, this team wants to control matches through circulation and movement. Midfielders rotate into space, fullbacks push wider. The ball moves quickly through central zones before shifting toward the wings. Intention is clear. Mexico wants rhythm. Rhythm without control can become dangerous against elite opponents. When the spacing stretches too far, the defensive line becomes exposed. Midfield can lose compactness, and suddenly the game becomes emotional instead of organized. It is not. World Cups are often decided in moments where structure disappears. For 5 seconds, Mexico knows this. That is why players like Edson Álvarez matter so much. Edson Álvarez is not just a defensive midfielder. This team, he is the emotional stabilizer. He protects transitions, he slows panic. He restores shape after chaos. And against stronger nations, those details become survival mechanism. But here is the concern. If Álvarez gets isolated, Mexico's structure can collapse very quickly under pressure, because the current system still depends heavily on emotional momentum. Confidence rises, the football becomes faster and more aggressive. Passing angles appear. The crowd energy increases. Mexico suddenly looks dangerous again. But when matches become physically chaotic, organization sometimes disappears. That inconsistency is the tactical question hanging over this team before 2026. Mexico control difficult moments against elite opposition, or will emotional football eventually pull them out of structure again? Mexico's attacking approach is most dangerous when the game becomes fluid, not random. Fluid, wide progression still matters heavily to this team. Wingers attack isolated defenders. Overlaps create crossing angles, midfield combinations. Try to drag defensive lines out of shape before accelerating vertically. Knitting. And this is where Santiago Giménez becomes one of the most important figures in the entire project. It's because may finally have us capable of becoming the central attacking reference point. Santiago Giménez is not just a finisher. In this system, he represents attacking clarity. Mexico often created movement without enough penalty box authority. Attacks looked active, but not always decisive. Listed, but the final action sometimes lacked conviction. Giménez changes the emotional geometry of the attack. Movement inside the box creates targets. His positioning forces defensive reactions. Midfielders, a direct destination for progressive passes. But the bigger question is not whether Giménez can score. The question is whether Mexico can consistently create stable attacking conditions around him. Because elite strikers still depend on structure. And this is where tournament football becomes unforgiving. If transitions become chaotic, the striker becomes isolated. If the midfield loses compactness, chance creation slows down. If possession turns emotional, instead of controlled, the entire attacking system becomes fragmented. That is why Mexico's 2026 story cannot depend on one player alone. The names are important, but the relationships between those players matter even more. Hirving Lozano still represents one of the most emotionally explosive elements in the squad. Even now, he remains dangerous because he changes tempo instantly. Hirving Lozano is not just a winger. In this team, he is a transitioned trigger. When Mexico accelerates suddenly, Lozano often becomes the player who transforms pressure into momentum. One aggressive carry, one diagonal movement, one attack into space. Suddenly, the emotional energy inside the stadium changes completely. That matters in tournament football, especially at home. But there is also risk attached to that style. Because transition-heavy football can become unstable if the rest of the structure cannot support it. And this is where Mexico's balance remains certain. The team wants vertical aggression without losing control. Much harder than it sounds. Meanwhile, Johan Vásquez may become one of the quiet foundations of the project. Not the loudest player in the system. He is not the emotional headline. But Mexico desperately needs defensive stability before 2026. Johan Vásquez is not just a center back. In this team, he represents defensive order. Neat anticipation and composure could become essential against elite attacking transitions. Because eventually we'll face capable of punishing every structural mistake. And tournament football rarely forgives defensive panic. This is why the defensive line may quietly decide how far Mexico can actually go. Not the crowd, not the atmosphere, not the emotional energy, the defensive structure. There is one uncomfortable reality Mexico still cannot fully escape. Against elite opponents, the emotional intensity of the game can pull them out of structure. And at the World Cup level, that becomes dangerous very quickly, because tournament football is different from regional dominance, different from home qualifiers, different from matches where emotional momentum alone can overwhelm opponents. The margins become smaller. One defensive transition can decide everything. One failed press can open the entire midfield. One emotional reaction can change the rhythm of the match completely. Mexico still looks vulnerable when games become psychologically unstable. This is not only tactical, it is emotional football management. The best tournament teams understand how to difficult moments without losing their identity. France has done it. Argentina learned how to do it. Croatia built an entire football culture around surviving emotional pressure. Mexico is still searching for that level of control, because sometimes the team plays too fast when patience is required. Possessions becomes passive instead of threatening. Machine looks clean, but the aggression disappears. The structure exists, but the belief does not fully arrive with it. And this is where the pressure of hosting becomes dangerous. The crowd can elevate Mexico emotionally, but expectation can also speed the game up artificially. Attack feels urgent. Every mistake feels louder. Every nervous moment becomes heavier inside the stadium atmosphere. Emotional environment can either create tournament momentum or tactical panic. And this is why of the biggest psychological tests in modern Mexican football modern football history. New challenge is no longer proving passion. The world already knows Mexico has passion. The challenge is proving emotional control under elite pressure. So how dangerous can Mexico really be in 2026? The honest answer is complicated. This team probably does not enter the tournament as one of the clear favorites. The squad depth is not at the level of France. The individual quality across every line is not equal to the strongest European powers. Structurally, there are still important questions that remain resolved. Unresolved. Football has never been purely logical, and host nations change emotionally during World Cups. Momentum becomes contagious. Confidence changes rapidly. One result can transform an entire atmosphere. Mexico understands tournament emotion better than most countries. The concern is whether they can combine that emotional energy with enough tactical discipline to survive against elite opponents. What if, because there are real reasons for optimism, Santiago Giménez could become one of the emotional faces of the tournament if the attacking structure supports him properly. Álvarez gives the midfield aggression and balance. Johan Vásquez may help stabilize the defensive line. And if the attacking transitions become efficient, Mexico can still create difficult moments for almost any opponent. But one issue still remains. The system must survive pressure, not just pressure from opponents. Pressure from expectation. Pressure from hosting. Pressure from hosting. Pressure from millions of supporters expecting emotional redemption on home soil is the real World Cup challenge facing Mexico. And this is what makes their story so fascinating. Before 2026, not certainty, uncertainty, because this team does not feel complete yet. But maybe that is exactly why they remain dangerous. Mexico enters the 2026 World Cup carrying something heavier than tactical expectation. identity pressure. The country wants a team that plays with courage, with rhythm, with emotional intensity, but also with enough control to survive modern tournament football. That balance is incredibly difficult to build, especially under the pressure of hosting. And maybe that is why this Mexico team feels so difficult to predict. There are moments where the structure looks promising, moments where the tactical evolution becomes visible, moments where players like Santiago Giménez and Edson Álvarez of leading a mysterious modern tournament side. Then the instability returns, the game speeds up, the spacing stretches, the emotional weight becomes visible again. And this is where their 2026 story will probably be decided. Not by hype, not by nostalgia, not by crowd noise alone, but by whether Mexico can finally connect emotion with control. Because if they solve that balance, even partially, the atmosphere around a home World Cup could become one of the most dangerous emotional forces in the tournament. But if they fail to control those moments, the pressure of hosting may become the thing that exposes them the most. That is what makes Mexico one of the most fascinating teams heading toward 2020.